Okay, hi, my name's Stephen Morales. I'm the Chief Executive of the Institute of School Business Leadership, and I'm going to be presenting today on the third of 3 webinars that I've been delivering for Governors for Schools. And the subject that we're going to be covering today is financial planning and value for money. Right, so if we start by just going through the items that we're going to cover in the presentation, we're essentially going to look today at what you need to have in place, what to look out for, and how you develop your strategic plan to ensure that you achieve exactly what it says on the tin: financial planning, robust financial planning, and value for money. So the first thing to say is that there are a series of numbers that it's really important to have a handle on. In fact, there are 10 that I'm going to go through today, and we'll take each one of them at a time. But I'll just quickly canter through the list. So we have staff pay as a percentage of total expenditure. We have average teacher costs. We have pupil-to-teacher ratios, known as PTR. We're going to cover class sizes, teacher contact ratios, the proportion of budget spend on the leadership team, 3 to 5 year budget projections, spend per pupil for non-pay expenditure lines compared to similar schools. We're going to talk a lot about benchmarking and how we use that to our advantage. School improvement plan priorities and the relative cost of the various options. So when you're developing your plans, there'll be some red lines in terms of what you're prepared to concede, and there'll be some areas where you're prepared to make adjustments or concessions. And then finally, we're going to talk about contracts and renewal dates. Quite often, particularly when we're busy and we've had contracts in place for many years, we roll them on, and we don't do the appropriate due diligence or reflect on the way that we are spending money on those contracts that maybe we've had for many years. So the 10 checks and how we apply them. It's really important to use these checks early in the annual budget planning cycle. I can't emphasize enough. It should be a very proactive and strategic approach. It shouldn't be reactive, and we certainly don't want to leave these things till the final hour. We should adopt a joined up approach to all of this. I'm going to talk more about joined up leadership later on, but important to have involved in the planning process your school business professional, your head teacher, chief executive, governors, trustees, etc. Compare spend trends with other schools. Again, we go back to benchmarking. National benchmarking is very helpful, but also benchmarking with local schools in a similar context to you is perhaps even more powerful. And when we've got the numbers, we don't need to be a slave to the metrics, but it is useful to know where we sit in terms of the national averages, local trends, and so forth. And often when we find ourselves as a bit of an outlier, it's helpful to have the conversation both internally and with those that are procuring services and spending money in a slightly different way, to see if we can establish whether there are any improvements that can be made. So moving on, we'll take each one of the 10 checks in turn, and we'll start off with staff pay as a percentage of total expenditure. Now, it probably doesn't need me to tell you that salaries, staff costs are the most expensive budget item in a school. Typically over 70%, sometimes well in excess of 70%. And as trustees and governors, you might want to ask the following question: what percentage of the budget is spent on staffing compared to other similar schools? And again, you can look at that nationally, you can look at it locally. It's probably worth doing both. How does the percentage for teaching staff, curriculum support staff and other support staff compare with other similar schools? Again, that's an exercise you might want to do both on a national level and by talking to schools that you have a relationship in the vicinity. Staying on staff pay as a percentage of total expenditure, we need to ask the question: how do pupil outcomes compare with similar schools, and in particular relative to the spend on staff? What's the overall staff cost as a percentage of total income? And if it's over 80%, that should be ringing some alarm bells. That's very high. If teaching costs are high, is the number of teachers or the proportion of highly paid leaders, is it disproportionate? And I think what we see there is that in some cases we have either very large leadership team compared to the size of the school, or we have a number of individuals within that leadership team who are paid in excess of national averages. Now that isn't to say that that's wrong, but I think the question we need to be asking is what's the return on investment? Have we recruited? Do we have in place particularly skilled, experienced and talented individuals that we need to retain? And it's worth that extra cost because of the outcomes that they are delivering. So it's about perspective and balance, but we do need to ask the question. Okay, moving on to the second item, we're going to talk about average teacher cost. This measure is calculated by dividing the total teaching cost by the full-time equivalent number of teachers. And the question you need to be asking here is, if the average teacher cost is high in comparison with other similar schools, why is this the case? And is it due to the staff grading profile? And what we mean by that is, do we have a high number of staff on the upper pay scale as compared to main pay scale? That's often the case in schools where there's low levels of attrition, so high levels of retention. In other words, staff that have stayed loyal to the school, that enjoy their working life there, have been there for a number of years and have moved up the scales, which is great because obviously there's a good working relationship, the commitment and loyalty from the teachers. But if that represents the majority of your staffing profile, that's going to be a lot more expensive than schools that have a mix of upper pay spine teachers and NQTs and some in the middle. And again, you need to make sure that that investment is paying dividends. The other thing you might want to look at is the responsibility structure in the school. Do you have large middle leader teams? Are you retaining people by using teaching and learning responsibility points, even though they don't have any management responsibilities? Are you using honorarium and recruitment and retention payments? Again, none of it's wrong, but it will cost money, and you just need to be clear that that strategy is getting you the best results. And there could be other reasons. There could be some legacy reasons, some commitments that were made historically, perhaps with the local authority. and then you find yourself in a situation where you're perhaps out of kilter with national averages. And all these things can be looked at and in most cases renegotiated. Okay, the third thing is something called pupil-to-teacher ratio. The PTR is calculated by dividing the number of full-time equivalent pupils by the total number of FTE teachers. A low PTR suggests small class sizes, which in and of itself is not the end of the world, but obviously a small class, small class sizes are expensive to run. And again, we just need to look carefully at how sustainable that is. You also might want to review the average pupil-teacher ratio and pupil-to-adult ratios in other similar schools and academies. The ratio of pupils to all educational staff is particularly relevant in primary schools, just because the way that the timetable is structured. And of course, we don't have in primary, we don't necessarily have lessons taught. We don't teach by subject. We teach by key stage, and there are interventions that go on throughout the day. The impact of teaching assistants. So if we're introducing lots of interventions, and we believe that we need more bodies in the classroom, I think the evidence from research from the Education Endowment Foundation suggests that increasing the number of teaching assistants in classrooms and having one or two teaching assistants for every single primary school teacher isn't necessarily resulting in improved outcomes. So again, you just need to have a look at your own context and think carefully about the way you're deploying those teaching assistants. Okay, still on pupil-to-teacher ratios, perhaps there's a few questions we want to ask as governors and trustees. What is the PTR for different key stages within the school? So that's quite an interesting question, and again, back to the last statement, there isn't always strong evidence for lots of adults in front of the child. How do pupil-teacher ratios compare with similar schools? Back to benchmarking. And how does the ratio of pupils to staff compare with similar schools? Okay, number 4, class sizes. The smaller the class size, the greater the cost of delivery per pupil. We've talked about that. You might want to ask, what's the average class size by key stage, and the options at key stage 4 and key stage 5. You also might want to ask, what is your optimum class size and why? So why 24 or 26 or 28? What is the impact on teaching and learning if we move beyond 28? And what benefits are there by having very small classes, 20, 22? And again, looking at the return on investment, does the cost of keeping classes at a particular size warrant the improvement in outcomes? Still on class sizes, are there small classes where the pupil funding does not cover the cost of delivery? In some cases, the answer might be yes. What we need to be clear about is that if there is subsidy from other areas of the curriculum, from other departments, that's the right strategy. And it may be that we've looked at the pupil performance data and we need to invest more heavily in a particular faculty over another one, in which case, you know, there's your answer. But if we're doing this blindly, and you know, we're finding that a particular class costs more than it should do, and there isn't a strategy behind it, then, you know, we should be perhaps reflecting on that. Do we know what the maximum average class size for the school is, and within that context, what do we know about pupil admissions, the structure of the building, the numbers in different year groups, and what intervention strategies are currently in place? The fifth of the checks to look at, teacher contact ratio. This is the total number of teaching periods timetabled for all teachers in the school, and then dividing that number by the total possible number of teaching periods. All teachers have a guaranteed minimum of 10% PPA, therefore a teacher contact ratio will always be lower than 1. So don't be surprised if you see that, because there is a guarantee that the teachers get that PPA time, and it's right. They have the space to do that preparation. Still on teacher contact ratio, questions you might want to ask: would changes to the teacher contact ratio impact the overall budget? Are teachers undertaking roles that could be done by support staff? How does your school compare against integrated curriculum, financial planning, national benchmarks? And we'll come back to ICFP a little bit later, so don't worry too much about that for now. On to number 6, the proportion of budget spent on the leadership team. And this is really quite a live area of conversation across the system. Schools have many different leadership and management structures, but I think it's important to note that both a fairly large leadership team or executive team, well, firstly, a large leadership team, executive team with very little contact with pupils is going to be an expensive model. Again, there could be good reason for that. Secondly, if on top of the size of the team, the salaries that are being afforded to senior members of staff is very high, again, that's going to throw your ratios off. The other thing to note is that some schools calculate the cost of non-class-based leadership time as a percentage of total expenditure, as compared to similar schools by collaborative exchanges of summary information. Some schools will include all leadership time as one and then do the maths, and some will say, you know what, we're going to take out any non-class-based leadership, and then we're going to do 2 sets of calculations, one for class-based leadership and one for, if you like, yeah, those generic executive leadership and operational tasks. And of course, it's important you do a like-for-like comparison, because if you're not applying the same methodology, you're going to get distorted outcomes. I would suggest that you should know both sets of ratios. So do the calculation using the whole leadership spend as a percentage, and then split out non-class-based leadership and pedagogical leadership. Still on the proportion of budget spent on the leadership team, you might want to ask, how does this compare with similar schools, taking into account any contact time the leadership staff have? If there is more than one school in your trust or federation, are the leadership structures proportionally the same? How has your school made decisions on the proportion of its budget to be spent on the leadership team? If this is relatively high or low compared with similar schools, is this because of the size of the leadership team or because of their pay, or perhaps both? Number 7, 3 to 5 year budget projections. And again, when I speak to schools up and down the country, we often get into the debate about budget uncertainty, no clear policy on funding. It's impossible in this time of political uncertainty to look too far ahead. And should we be planning 3 years or 5 years? I would suggest that it's reasonable to expect all schools to be developing a 3-year plan, and there's some uncertainty, but there's enough certainty to develop some reasonable assumptions to build up a picture of where you might be in 3 years' time. You can extrapolate that out to 5 years, but I agree the 5-year look ahead is to an extent difficult in the sense that you really are guessing beyond the 3-year point. But yes, certainly the year that we're in, the year that we're planning for beyond that, and the year beyond that, I think it's absolutely reasonable. And assumptions should include projected pupil numbers, free school meal numbers, likely pupil premium income, projections of staffing that will be necessary in these years. And I think unless you've got huge mobility issues in your school, that all of those numbers you should have a reasonable handle on, and you should be able to see, look back at the trend and look forward at what you're expecting. Still on the 3 to 5 year budget, schools should plan their staffing based on a set of multi-year projections. I think that's reasonable. We're not employing people for a year at a time. We hope they're going to be with us for a lot longer than that, and as a consequence, we should be able to make informed judgments as to what our staffing commitment is likely to look like. And then we might want to ask, how confident are we that pupil number projections are realistic? Again, I think if there's not high levels of mobility, we should be able to forecast that, but always working on the basis of caution and cautiously optimistic, but cautious, not overly optimistic, and hoping that things will happen if the stars align and we have a fair wind behind us. So pragmatic, cautious. Still on budgets. If the cautious budget indicates potential financial difficulties, we need to think about what contingency plans do we have to overcome them. We'll talk about that a little bit later on in terms of joined up approach to budget planning, but essentially we need to know what it is that's absolutely core, where are our red lines in terms of our curriculum ambition, and where can we make concessions, particularly in our operational spend, that means that we can still deliver the things that matter to us. Are there any issues in the medium term that should be addressed now? How will current decisions impact medium-term budgets? And what do we need to put in place now to ensure we have the necessary funding in the future? And that's all about avoiding short-termism. So we're looking way beyond the end of the next financial year. We're not just going to throw the kitchen sink at achieving good or outstanding, and then we're going to fall off a cliff edge and be in real trouble. So it's always about what's on the horizon. At least the 3-year budget forecast, 5 if we can, and making sure that our projections, our plans are sustainable. Okay, we're getting there in terms of the 10 checks. We're on number 8 now. So spend per pupil for non-pay expenditure lines compared to similar schools. And what we want to be asking here is, what is the spend per pupil for things like catering, ICT, estates management, business administration, utilities, and curriculum resources? We might want to ask the question, if benchmarking indicates relatively high spend on a particular expenditure line, why is that? And that's where the conversation comes in. So we've done some benchmarking locally. We found other schools spending a little bit less than us. Why is that? Is that because they've gone to more competitive suppliers? Is it because they're working with other schools to gain economies of scale? The conversation is important. Or are the reasons unavoidable? And if they're unavoidable, can we look elsewhere to make some savings to offset that unavoidable extra cost? Okay, still on number 8. If the cost of energy seems high compared with similar schools, can you invest in energy saving measures to reduce the cost? And there are plenty of those available. There's the Crown Commercial Services, the government-led initiative, where there are some really interesting deals, and there are a whole bunch of energy procurement experts dedicated to education that can both analyse your current spend and offer some very competitive alternative deals. If spend on learning resources seems high compared to similar schools, are there opportunities for collaborating with other schools to bring down the costs? We just talked about that in the previous slide. So it may be that you come together with a group of schools, you create some kind of procurement hub, and you go to the market en masse and try and negotiate a much more competitive rate. Multi-academy trusts may want to compare their level of top slice with other mats, have a look at what it's used for, and make sure that it provides value for money for members of the academy. What we don't want is multi-academy trusts taking a top slice or a management fee and squirreling that money away, or indeed even worse, paying executives generous salaries at the expense of resources going to the front line. So again, a top slice used sensibly makes absolute sense. It can take a lot of pressure away from local schools, and in fact, depending on the size of the mat, you improve your buying power. But the motivation for top slice and the rationale needs to be clear, transparent, and absolutely in the interests of the community of learners that it serves. Number 9. School improvement plan priorities and the relative cost options. So the budgetary process sits firmly within the strategic leadership framework and should link into the overall management and planning cycle. That would seem obvious. What we need to ask is, are school improvement initiatives prioritised, costed, and linked to the budget? Again, that brings us back to this notion of joined up leadership. Are the right people in the room, are the right people involved in the conversation? Governance, business, and pedagogy. Again, we'll talk about that in a couple of slides' time. And are all new initiatives fully costed before your school is committed to any of the proposals that are being put forward? And finally, I mentioned when we started the webinar that we would just touch on contracts. It's important that there is a list of contracts with costs and renewal dates. Every school should have one. Each year, your school trust should review its contract for all of its services and look at provision, and look at which ones are due for renewal, when was the last time they were renewed, test the renewal rates with other providers, make sure that the commitments that were made in any contracts, service level agreements, are being adhered to, and ultimately ask the question: are all contracts due for renewal value for money? Are they giving you what you need? Do they represent value for money? And are they still competitive? And if they pass the test, then fine, renew the contract. If they don't, then we look to the market for an alternative. And there are plenty of alternatives out there. Just finally, still on contracts, we should really ask the question: are there any regular payments for services that are an invoice only contract, and include all goods and services on contract lists for single item and routine purchases such as stationery? So this is all just it's belt and braces, but good practice. Okay, so we've gone through the checklist of 10, really helpful guide, really, to make sure that to ensure the ongoing financial health of your school or your trust, and to make sure that the decisions that are being used or being made to plan for the forthcoming years are backed up and justified, and that there's some proper thinking gone into all of these decisions. So now what we're going to try and do is bring everything together, and I'm going to talk about joined up leadership and integrated curriculum-led financial planning. So as I mentioned earlier in the webinar, there are 3 pillars of education leadership fundamentally, and they include pedagogy, so that's your teachers, your middle leaders, your head teachers, your executive heads. There's business, which includes your school business manager, your school business director, your finance director, your HR director, your CFO, your COO, maybe a director of procurement if you're a large MAT. And then there's governance, and governance includes local governing bodies, includes trust boards of directors, who are charged with the oversight and accountability, direct accountability of the executive leaders and managers of a school or a trust. And then in the middle of all that, of course, we have children, and the relationship, a strong joined up approach to leadership where pedagogy, business and governance is working seamlessly together, absolutely with the interests of pupil outcomes at the core. That's when things work brilliantly. What we sometimes observe, and not that pupil outcomes aren't a high priority, but what we sometimes observe is those responsible for business and finance squirreled away with a budget plan, trying to make things balance, so the bottom line becomes the imperative. You might have another group of pedagogical leaders looking at the curriculum and timetabling, and they're obsessed with achieving the curriculum ambition, but also making sure that staff are being deployed to the various departments, and that the timetable is covered, perhaps without reference to what that's going to cost. And then finally, you have governors and trustees that are only brought into the conversation after the effect. And what we actually want is we want a set of financial projections, a picture of the resources that are available, and both governing bodies of trustees and pedagogical leaders should be cited in terms of what resources are available. And then you want pedagogical leaders to set out clearly their ambition in terms of the curriculum, what space they need, what teachers they want to deploy, what talent they need within the organisation. And collaboratively, we should be working to fully cost this ambition and doing everything possible to make sure that there are resources available to deliver the most important areas of teaching and learning. And the governing body, the trustees, need to be challenging those assumptions, making sure they are robust, using the 10 checks that we've just talked about, and feeling satisfied that the due diligence and the careful prioritisation, is taken when compiling financial plans. So that's what I mean by effective joined up leadership, and those groups not operating in silos. In terms of curriculum-led financial planning, I mean, at its most basic level, it comprises of the 3 component parts in this graphic, and I must say, as a starter, that you'll see at the top left-hand side a grid which shows pupil numbers, year groups, minimum class size, and then shows period 1, 2, 3, 4. Now that is very secondary orientated, but you could easily adapt that for primary. So instead of periods, you just move to entire key stages. So you have pupil numbers, you have a key stage, you have a minimum class size, and you know, that's the data that will drive the rest of the exercise. On the right hand side, you will see a set of operational costs. There is also reference to a top slice, and that's for academies. You know, if certain functions are being delivered centrally, there needs to be a consideration there. But essentially, that operational set of costs are costs that you would see in all schools: leadership costs, teaching costs, supply, back office administration, premises, professional services, and so forth. And then finally, on the bottom left hand side, there is an area for DFE funding and other income. Now clearly, if your curriculum ambition, top left hand side, and your operational costs, bottom right hand side, exceed your grant income, then you have a problem, and that might be a problem you can deal with in year 1, possibly year 2 if you've got reserves, but certainly that's not sustainable. So the question you need then to ask is, having designed the curriculum and looked at the teachers that you want to deploy for different key stages or different subjects, is that affordable if there are no savings that can be made in your operational area, or are there areas operationally that you can look at again? For example, professional services. Could you procure your approach to grounds maintenance slightly better? Could you reduce down your utility costs by a more creative approach to procurement? If so, it may be that you can preserve all of your curriculum desires. So it really helps you to prioritise, and it's this picture that should be shown and should be negotiated with all the key stakeholders. So that's those responsible for pedagogy, those responsible for governance, and those responsible for finance. Again, bringing it back to that joined up approach. Now that was very much a high-level view of integrated curriculum-led financial planning. So we'll get into the weeds a bit more now on what ICFP really is. So ICFP stands for Integrated Curriculum Financial Planning. It is an important way to review school financial resources, and and uses it in the wider sense to ensure curriculum delivery aims are met. It integrates the school and trust's teaching and learning ambition and financial resource management and into one fully integrated approach. ICFP uses a reasonably simple set of metrics, which we'll go into in a minute. It's not a new idea. In fact, the origins of ICFP go back as far as the LMS and GM days, so late 1980s, early 1990s. It was then called Cosmos, and you'll see schools have used this across the system to a greater or lesser extent for many years. And there are a number of tools. There are a number of training providers. There is no one prescribed way of implementing ICFP, but there are some well-established approaches and metrics. So what we have done as an institute is that we've identified what we believe to be the 12 key metrics, and it's no coincidence that the 12 metrics that I'm going to talk about now coincide with the 10 checks that we talked about at the beginning of this presentation. Before I go on, I will say that some will argue that some of these metrics aren't applicable, or it's very difficult to apply them to a primary school setting, and I accept that, but I would argue that the majority are applicable. So if we go through the metrics, pupil-teacher ratio, applicable to both primary and secondary. Pupil-adult ratio, again, applicable to both primary and secondary. Teacher contact ratio, average teacher cost per lesson cost, average class size, per teacher lesson cost. Those three, I would agree, are more difficult in a primary context. Average class size, clearly applicable to both primary and secondary. Total teaching staff cost as a total percentage of revenue income, again applicable to both. Curriculum support staff cost as a percentage of total revenue income, applicable to both. Non-curriculum support staff costs as a percentage of total revenue, again applicable to both. Total staff cost as a percentage of total revenue income, applicable to both. Leadership cost as a percentage of total teaching cost, applicable to both. And management cost as a percentage of total teaching cost, again applicable to both. Now on the left hand side there are some balances that we use as part of our tool, but I mean they're there for reference, and certainly you're going to have a copy of these slides, and when you look at the next slide, when you're reconciling the 12 metrics and the balances, it'll make more sense, but I'm not going to read through those today. The next slide shows you our tool. Again, don't worry too much about the detail. The way that you populate this is very intuitive. There are a set of tabs, and it guides you through guides you through the source data that you need to complete the tool. You punch in the number, you move to the next page, and so forth, and then what it will do is spit out this analysis. And what you'll see across a 5-year period is whether or not you are within a range, whether you are, that particular metric is high risk, low risk, or somewhere in between. And we use red, amber, green. It's a RAG rating. So for example, if we take in 2017, 2018, and we look at current year in-year deficit surplus, we can see that it's red, and that's because in terms of a range, that would be outside of what we would consider to be low risk. So that for us is a bit of an alert to say actually that needs to be looked at more closely. We go up one, we see non-staff spend as a percentage of total revenue income. It's green. It's green because that level is telling us that there isn't a risk at all. So if you go down and look in teaching staff metrics on the left-hand side, look at average class size, and again, we see an amber RAG rating, and it's a low amber because although it's not no risk, it's a very low risk. So we indicate it as such. So once you've populated all the numbers, you end up with this heat map. It's very useful to determine where you are in terms of national averages, but it's also useful for trustees and governors to say, actually, perhaps we need to have a conversation about some of these areas, and we need to determine, one, why we're an outlier, and secondly, what are the strategies to bring us in line with what would be the norm. Now, that's an incredibly quick canter through integrated curriculum-led financial planning, but hopefully you get a sense of the concept and the power that it can have in terms of, one, assessing your financial health, but and secondly the optimum deployment of the resources that you've got available to you. If you want to learn more about our integrated curriculum financial planning tool, it's called I-SOT, and it's available on our website at the link that's showing on the screen just there. Now, I think we're close to the end of the hour, but I've got a few minutes just to go through some questions that came in before we started the presentation. So I'll do my very best to answer those. So we had the first question that came through was, should schools maintain a risk register? I didn't cover risk registers in this presentation. Absolutely they should. And risk covers a whole plethora of activity. It's not just financial risk, although financial risk is an important element. In many respects, what we've just had a look at, the red, amber, green, is a risk rating, and applying a RAG rating to other activity is no bad thing. Certainly in terms of health and safety and compliance, absolutely important. In terms, you could look at risk across a number of areas, so financial risk, reputational risk, legal risk, and so forth. Really important, but it's a topic all on its own. But the short answer is yes, absolutely. All schools should be maintaining a risk register. There's a question here. So are the numbers, are the ratios the same for both academies and maintained schools? Well, as ever, context is king. What benchmarking will tell you is, or the idea of benchmarking is to find a comparable school with similar characteristics and make a judgment on that basis. I would say that the percentages of some of the key metrics that we talked about earlier on in this presentation, for example, pupil-teacher ratio, the total spend on salaries, yes, they apply to both maintained and academies, single academies, multi-academy trusts, and the like. So I wouldn't discriminate one from the other. There's a question here, what is the link to benchmarking data? Well, I think the important thing to say is that the averages that we use in determining whether a school is within a range or an outlier are exactly that. they are based on national data, and if you use the metrics that we talk about and the values that we state within our guidance, they are derived from conversations that are taken place across the system, and the national benchmarking data that the DFE make available to the sector are essentially that it's the sector's numbers crunched and averages derived. There's a question here that I think I've touched on this already. Can you explain how primary schools can use ICFP? And I think that there's a reasonable pushback. The way that you run a primary school is quite different to the way you run a secondary school. Things are done by key stage in the main, not by lesson. I agree that it's difficult to use all of the metrics that we've described today, but as I said earlier in the presentation, many of them are certainly applicable. There's a question here. I think this is a question about funding. How do primary schools make predictions regarding projected numbers of free school meals and pupil, and by association pupil premium? Well, I mean, I think that's pretty straightforward. Everything the way that the funding formula works is that it's taken from the previous year's census. So the census is published in October, and then that will drive funding for the following year. So it depends on the profile, your pupil profile at that point. If you get lots of pupil premium eligible pupils in after the census, then there is always going to be a lag in terms of your funding. Conversely, if you were receiving a lot of pupil premium and you lost pupil premium children, you would benefit from that even when they'd left for a short period. And then finally, I'll leave it there because we are running short of time now. There's a question here, I think very important. Once TLRs are awarded, and I guess that's TLRs, honorarium and recruitment and retention points, can they be either reduced or taken away? I think the straightforward answer is yes, but that would need to be done, well, it would be advisable to do that in conjunction with the union reps, and there would need to be, firstly, a clear reason for the award to be taken away, so something would have to change. The member of staff would need to, of course, need to be consulted, and as long as the process was open, transparent, fair, and you weren't expecting the individual to continue to undertake those management roles, then there should be no reason why salary doesn't revert to the national scales according to their main pay scale or upper pay scale point. But of course, this is a very sensitive subject and always needs to be done in conjunction with union reps, proper consultation, and sensible dialogue. Okay, I hope you all found that interesting and useful. The 3 webinars that I've undertaken with Governors for Schools. If you would like to talk to me or any of my colleagues further, please get in touch with us at isbl.org.uk. Thank you very much.